Good afternoon. I gather this is Janneke here from ITS Canada, General Manager, and I guess that those who are listening, you are in. You cannot talk, but you can hear me, and so we will be starting in about 2 minutes with the with this webinar. Sometimes 2 minutes lasts forever. My name is Janneke. I'm the General Manager of ITS Canada, and I would like to welcome you all to this APTS webinar. We'll hear from two presenters today. First one will be Bill Menzies from Dillon Consulting. Second presentation will be by Brendon Hemily, who is the chair of the APTS Technical Committee of ITS Canada. And Brendon, I'm going to put myself on mute and I'll let you say a few words. Thank you.
Thanks, Janneke. Can you hear me okay? Assume so. My name's Brendon Hemily. I'm chair of the APTS committee of ITS Canada. APTS is Advanced Public Transit Systems. So it's basically the transit ITS aspects that we focus on, one of 4 technical committees at ITS Canada. And so we have regular conference calls and organize webinars from time to time. And so this webinar so we thought it would be useful to focus on the uses of data. And that's sort of a topic of growing interest. And I thought for this purpose to invite Bill Menzies, former manager of service development at Winnipeg Transit, who I've known for a very long time, and was definitely one of the on the forefront of using data all his career at Winnipeg Transit, and now he works with Dillon Consulting, and mentioned that he was working on a very interesting project for OC Transpo on using data, various sources of data for identifying and prioritizing priority treatment. So with that, Bill, I'll let you present, and then I will afterwards present more sort of a higher level discussion of transit data. But I'll pass it over to Bill at this point in time. Bill, I think you have control of the presentation.
Okay, thanks very much, Brendon. What I want to do today is provide you with a brief overview of some very interesting work we did with OC Transpo in Ottawa last year. And it doesn't look like I have control of this screen. No, Janneke, can you forward control to me?
Talking into the mic. I cannot see you as giving you control. Maybe Brendon?
Oh. There we go. I think it's working now. Sorry about that, folks. Yeah, our colleagues in doing this project were a couple of folks from OC Transpo, Derek Washnock and Francois Kirouette. And what they were interested, it's working very slowly. What they were interested in doing was integrating data from various ITS systems to identify those parts of the on-street network that have the highest need for transit priority. And the data we wanted to put together was we call it supply, demand, and operations data. The supply data is from the GTFS files, or General Transit Feed Specification. The demand files are data collected by an automated passenger counting system, and the operations data are collected by the automatic vehicle location system in Ottawa. And what's important is that we're trying to identify those parts of the on-street network. Those of you who are familiar with Ottawa know that they have an extensive transitway network, soon to be replaced in part by a new LRT system. But we were not interested in those sections of the transitway that ran in exclusive rights-of-way, because that's already the ultimate priority. So there's a good portion of the map that you can see now that was off limits during this study. So our operational objective for the project, and first a definition of terms here. I'm going to use the term place, and what it really is a shorthand way of referring to a timing point along a route. And what we're trying to do is to identify those place-to-place links that are characterized by three things: high passenger loads, actual running times along the place link that are greater than the scheduled run times, and high variability in the run times. Might be very fast some days, very slow other days. So we're looking at variability as well. And just to give you an understanding of how this geometry works, pretend we've got a route here that's 5 stops, and we've got 3 timing points or places A, B, and C. So a place link is defined as, in this case, from A to B, and it has 2 constituent stop links, 1 to 2 and 2 to 3. Similarly, B to C is another place link, and it has 2 constituent stop links as well, 3 to 4 and 4 to 5. So, fairly straightforward, but that's how we're trying to organize the data. And the question is, why use place link as a unit of analysis? A couple of reasons. Scheduled run times are built by schedulers from place to place, not from stop to stop. And in fact, the stop-to-stop run times are just interpolated from the place-to-place ones. And when you look at the run times between places, they're sufficiently lengthy to identify meaningful variations in the actual run times. When you get the stop-to-stop run times, they're typically quite short, quite often less than a minute, or only a minute or 2. So you want to have a unit of analysis that's sufficiently lengthy that you can get some variation in the data. So talk about the supply data first, and this comes from the GTFS feed. The General Transit Feed Specification was developed by Google and I think TriMet in Portland, the transit agency there, to structure data in a consistent way from transit systems so that trip planning could be done online. And many transit systems now provide data in GTFS format for trip planning, but the data can also be used for a lot of analysis. And the basic way it's structured is that there's a routes file that's just got 1 entry in the file for every route. And each route listed in the routes file has 1 or more trips listed in a trips file, which just lists the trips. And then each trip visits a series of stops that are listed in the stops file at specific times listed in another file called stop times. And then there's a calendar file, could be a couple of them actually, that specify the days in which specific trips operate. So it's a fairly simple data structure, but very powerful if it's linked and combined together. So we've worked with a number of clients on taking GTFS data and actually combining the various files from GTFS and creating a broader and more comprehensive data set of supply. So on the left, you see the input files. The ones in black are the typical GTFS files that most systems provide. The ones in red are OC Transpo's names of the same file. In a couple of instances, there are some extra files that we had for this assignment. A stop type file, file 8 there on the left, and that was a simple designation of each stop in OC Transpo network as to whether the stop was in fact a stop or a station on the transitway. And then the time points file, file 9, was just a list of which stop to which each time point or place was assigned. So there's a number of output files. I won't go through them in a lot of detail. There's some that are very similar to what comes out of the basic GDFS files, but there's a few new ones, like the patterns file. A pattern is defined as a unique one-way bus trip from one terminal to another. So if you've got a simple route where all the buses go back and forth from one terminal to the other, there'd be 2 patterns, one outbound and one inbound. Of course, it gets a bit more complicated if there's short turns or if there are split legs and things like that. The pattern stop is a file that lists all the stops in each pattern in the order the bus visits them as it travels along the pattern. The pattern shape file lists all the shape points that define the on-street path so that you can draw it on a map. The itinerary file is a detailed listing of every trip on every what's called a block, which is a series of trips operated by a bus while it's out of the garage, and details in time order the stops and time points that the bus visits. And then there's links and place links, which are derived as well. And just to show you what those might look like, here's an example from Ottawa of a links file. It's done for Route 7 going inbound. It's on pattern 801. And there's actually 4 place links. They're color-coded here just to make it a bit easier to see. So one's from 4506 to 5414. So the convention here is that's the place ID number of the start place of the link, and the 5414 is the place ID of the end place of the link. So there's 4, as you can see. You can see where they start and where they end. And then within each place link, you can see the stop link sequences, the constituent stop links. So there's 8 stop links within the first place link. There's 4 stop links within the second place link, 3 stop links within the third place link, then just 1 stop link in the last one. And you get the what type of link it is. It's stop to stop. All these are stop to stop, but sometimes you might have stop to station if it's on the transitway, or station to station if it's a link on the transitway exclusively, or station to stop. So it was all the station to station links that we eliminated from the analysis. So that file I just showed you can then be condensed into a place links file. So again, it's a Route 7 going eastbound on that pattern 801. Here are the 4 place links. That's the place link ID, the start and the end location for them, the number of stops in the place link, and then the list of stops that make up that particular place link. And we found during the study that we had to do this because for any particular pair of places that are linked together, for any place link, there could be more than one path between them. If you have one route that uses one path and another route using the other. So the only way to differentiate them was to generate the stop list for each possible path between the place links. So, or between the places on the place link. So the combination of the place link ID, this field here, and the stop list gave a unique identifier for every place link in the system. So that's the supply data. The demand data is derived from the automatic passenger counting system. And more and more transit systems have this type of data available. And what's needed is a list of the average daily boardings and alightings at each stop and each scheduled trip in the schedule. And typically we work with weekday, but this can be done on Saturday and Sunday as well. And it's usually for the most recent fall or winter booking. A booking is a period of the year over which a schedule is in effect. They're usually very seasonal. And the reason we like the fall or the winter ones is those are the periods of highest ridership. And a client can provide to us either the average passenger counts for each stop and each trip for the schedule type, or give us the daily ones, and then we'll do the averaging after that. So to create the demand files, we take the raw data that we get from OC Transpo in this case. We combine it with some of the trips information and the itinerary information from the supply file, and we create a couple of output files. The most important one is what we call utilization file. I'll just show you what that looks like. Again, it's for a particular trip on Route 7 going in the eastbound direction. Again, it's using this pattern 801. And there's a list of stops that are on that particular trip in that pattern. So there's 17 stops on it. And here you have the stop ID. Ottawa uses a field that has some alphanumeric and numeric codes together. The name of the stop, the scheduled time that the bus is due to leave each of the stops, the interstop distance, so the distance to the previous stop, the cumulative distance along the path, along the trip, stop lat and stop long, which comes from GTFS, and then from the passenger counts you get the ons and offs at each stop, and from ons and offs you can derive the load. So this is a fairly early trip in the morning, around 6:30 to about 7 o'clock, so not highly utilized, but you can see what the load is, and it has a maximum load of about 9 people at the 11th stop. So there'd be a set of these records for every trip in the schedule on average on a weekday. So that's the demand data. The operations data is a lot more complex, and I'd venture to say that it's unique no matter what transit systems you go. It's got a lot of uniqueness to it. I'll show you a bit how it's structured in a second, but again, the first step is to create what we call a stop level data file of AVL information. So we took the raw data just for 2 days. We were doing this as a test on April 11th and 12th in 2017, and we combined some trips and itinerary data from the supply databases and create an AVL stop level file. So when you look at AVL data, it is quite immense. A lot of it's gathered, well, it's gathered each day on each bus, and there's different types of events that are recorded. And these are highly variable. They can measure things like when the bus starts its engine, if there's some mechanical issues, it can measure some of those. So there's literally hundreds of types of events that are logged and sent into very huge data files. So for this particular exercise, we were interested in 4 particular event types. The service stop is when a bus stops, opens its doors, and at a regular bus stop that's in the supply file, and there's boarding or alighting activity taking place at it. So it's a regular bus stop at which there's some people getting on or off. An unserviced stop is where the AVL has a timestamp, but it goes by a regular stop, but there's no passenger activity, so the doors don't open. An unknown stop is a stop that is someplace along the route, but is not at a recognized stop that the AVL could find, so it's just recorded as an unknown stop. Typically, this might happen shortly after a bus stop if you've forgotten one passenger and he stops and lets somebody on, for example. And then the last one is a time point record. So whenever it goes by a time point, there'll be a timestamp measured. So for those 2 days, we had about 900,000 records. And just to give you an idea what the data looks like, there's a timestamp here, which is broken down into the date and the time, the code, the event type, just what we went over. You know what bus it operated on, the trip number it operates on, the route, this is all Route 131. It would identify the stop, the latitude and longitude, and the stop sequence within the trip. And we knew that we wanted to match this data back to some of the supply data files and the demand data files, and we'd need the trip number, the stop sequence, and the stop ID, ideally, to make that match to the other the supply and demand databases. But what we found is that the stop ID measured by the AVL wasn't necessarily consistent with what was in the supply database. And here you can see an example where there's another code that's used. So in the end, we were matching just on trip number and stop sequence. So there's a lot of processing done. First of all, we had to add some information from the supply files, both from the trip level and from the stop level. And you see some of the typical types of variables that were added. And then when we did that, we found that there were some records that didn't match to the supply files because there was no matching trip number or stop sequence in the supply files, or vice versa. So that lost a little bit of data, about 11%. So we went from about 900,000 records to about 800,000 records. Still lots of information. And then the next step was to assign actual arrive and depart date time values to all the stop records, whether it was a known stop and unknown stop. And I'll show you how we did that in a second. And then once that was done, then in effect we were assigning the time point values, the date time values, to its associated stop. And then that reduced the data set from 800,000 records to about 640. So we had about 71% of the original EVL records. Just to give you an idea of how that's done, and I know the typeface is fairly small here, but bear with me. The first thing was to sort all of the records in the order of the event date time. So this is going from earliest to latest. And then we'd look at the time points that occurred immediately or listed in the file immediately in front of a stop, whether it was serviced or unserviced. And what we're trying to do is create values for actual arrive date time and actual depart date time for each stop record. So we'd say, okay, this particular time point was associated with this stop. So we'll take that thing shown in green, that time in green, and say that's the arrival time at the stop that it's associated with. And then the event date time at the stop then becomes the actual departure date time. Now, if you look at the values here, they're all the same. So it means the time point record and the service stop record got created exactly at the same stop. But if we look down at this next example, the time point was at 16:57:22. The stop was a few seconds later at 16:57:45. So we said for that stop, its arrival was 16:57:22, taken from the time point record, and the departure was what was from the stop record there. So 16:57:45. So it was a method of, or a procedure of going through, and there's several examples here, but I think you sort of get the drift of how that was done. And then once this was done, we ran into an issue where you might have had multiple stop records for the same stop sequence within a trip. I'll show you an example just in a second. So it meant merging those together into a single record as well. So once that was done, that transformed roughly the 900,000 ADL records into about almost 600,000 stop records, so about 65% of the original record volume. So once that was done, then for each stop level, we could calculate some performance indicators, the dwell time, so the difference between arrive and leave at each stop, the schedule deviation, and then Ottawa uses an on-time performance category, OTT, where basically if anything's more than 5 minutes late, it says it's late. If anything's early, it's called early. And anything between on time at 0 minutes on time and 5 minutes late is called on time. So there's a half a minute less time in the data to account for that. So that's kind of the standard that that Ottawa uses. Now this wasn't a particular objective of the exercise, but it was an intermediary file that got created that would provide some useful information. But here's an example of, we've got two stop sequences, 11 here. We've got a service stop and an unknown stop. And what we had to do was merge instances like this so that you would take the earliest time of those timestamp records for that particular stop and say that's the arrival time of that stop, and then take the latest time and say that's the departure time. So that transformed into a single record for this stop sequence 11, so that it was scheduled at 16:59. It arrived at 1700, so 5 o'clock, 17 seconds after that, and then left about 30-some seconds after that. So you can see the number of stop events that were made into that record. There's 2 in this case. So as a check on the data, we just graphed what the on-time performance was across all of the data that we had in the stop records. And what's along the x-axis is the deviation from schedule. So 0 means it was exactly on schedule. A minus sign means it was early. The buses was early, and well, the positive numbers means it was late. So you can see that, you know, almost over half of the distribution was rated 0, or its closest minute. And then it's slightly, you know, if you were to calculate the mean, it would be slightly late, you know, slightly positive number. So that gave us some confidence that the data was realistic after all of that data manipulation to get it to that point. And then we also looked at what the on-time performance using those categories of anything between 0 and 5 minutes late is considered on time. More than 5 minutes late is late. Anything early is early. And just broke it down by time period. So early morning, AM peak, midday, PM peak, early evening, and then late night. And the green is the percentage of buses that were on time. So it's fairly consistent. And this is what I've seen in a lot of transit systems. In the PM peak, the schedule adherence isn't quite as good because there seems to be more traffic congestion then. The red bars are the number of late buses. So again, that tends to peak in the PM peak. And early is around 20%, but which typically is a bit high, but you know, Ottawa's definition of early is pretty strict, so maybe it's not so surprising. But this is more of a check on the data than anything else. But we gave this file to OC Transpo, and it's something they can analyze in a lot of detail, doing different types of analysis by routes and whatnot. So that was the first step in dealing with the operations data. The second one was to create what we call an AVL placelink data file. And the inputs to that were the stop level file that you just saw, the links and the placelink data from the supply data set. And I'll try not to bore you too much with all the data manipulation here, but there's a lot of things that had to be done to create this placelink file. The stop link records had to be created from the stop level file, then attach the place link value to each stop link record, and then select the stop link records for each combination of trip number, operations date, and place link, for which there's a complete set of stop link records. And that really meant that you had to have a full set of data for each place link. Sometimes there was one stop link was missing, so then that we had to throw out those particular data. So that brought the number of records down to a little over 500,000. And then we needed to aggregate the stop link records into this place link record. So that gave us a data set of about 75,000. Then we calculated the deviation between actual and scheduled variables, like the run times along the place link. And then we looked at the distribution of that and we got rid of extreme values. Ones that made no sense, typically ones that were more than 3 standard deviations away from the mean. So that left us with about 70,000 records of place link data that we really wanted to analyze. So to put it all together, we created a place link transit priority file, and that was combining the place link file that we just talked about from operations, the utilization file from demand, the links, place link, and the pattern shape file from the supply data set. So the pattern shape we needed in order to draw these on a map. And that created a place link transit priority file. So what's in that file is that everything's summarized by place link, the stop list, to get a unique place link, and time period. So we want to do it for each of the major time periods of the day. And each record contains the total passenger load for all trips that operate on the place link during the time period, the scheduled runtime on the place link during the time period, so it would be the mean of all the trips that operate on there. Generally, they're pretty similar. So the mean will be very, you know, the distribution of the scheduled runtimes will be pretty tight. And then we look at the actual runtime on the place link during the time period. So we measured the mean, the standard deviation, and the coefficient of variation. The latter one, the coefficient of variation, is just simply the standard deviation divided by the mean. So it just kind of normalizes what the variability in the runtime is. And then we created it's a lot of data, as you can appreciate. And we wanted to create an index that tried to put it all together and provide an overall summary measure. So we did a lot of experimentation with this, and there's nothing in the literature to give you a lot of guidance on this. So we tried to find something that would work and that would differentiate the place lengths that most needed the transit priority. And there's nothing sacrosanct about this at all, but one that we found that worked quite well. So we looked at a combination of the load, the passenger load on the link, the difference between the actual runtime and the scheduled runtime, so that's a deviation, and looked at the coefficient of variation of the actual runtime. It gives an idea of the variability. So when the actual runtime is less than the scheduled runtime, that means there's really not an issue with the runtimes that are there. So in that case, we just gave 0.5 weight to load, nothing to the difference between actual runtime and scheduled runtime. But we're still interested in the variability, so we gave a weight of 2 there. And when the actual runtime is greater than scheduled runtime, then the weights are a little bit different. Well, still 0.5 for the passenger load, and a weight of 2 for the deviation between the actual runtime and the scheduled runtime, and then a weight of 2 for the coefficient of variation. And when we calculated that over all of the records, the range was from 0.4 to 1336. So we normalized that, so the range was between 0 and 100. So with the higher the value of the normalized index, the greater the need for transit priority. So we mapped that using ArcGIS, and we did it in 3D, so that the height of the place link is proportional to the value of the normalized index. And I'll just show you that in a second. And it's layered by time period and the place link's cardinal direction, east, west, north, or south. I'm just going to exit out of PowerPoint here and bring up the map. So hopefully this will come across the ether okay, but this looks kind of messy, but it's Ottawa, the Ottawa River here, Gatineau on the other side of the river, Ottawa in this area, looking generally north. And what we've done is we've layered the data by time period and direction. So we've got early morning, AM peak, midday, PM peak, and evening. And we can toggle on different directions. And the direction was determined just by looking at, if you drew a straight line from the place link start point to its end point, calculated what that direction was, and it was into one of the cardinal 4 directions. So looking at this, it looks a little messy. So we'll just look, for example, at the westbound, and it's this kind of blue color. And what's nice about this particular interface is you can rotate around and look at it in different ways. But if you look at this one, this particular link here, it's quite high. It's not on the transitway, obviously, but that's an obvious one that needs to be looked at as a potential place for transit priority. Here's another one. I think this is on a bridge that goes across from Ottawa to Gatineau, so it may or may not be possible to do priority there. And then if you go into various parts of the city, you can find different ones at different heights and different time periods. Now, some of my colleagues in our Ottawa office who are more familiar with Ottawa's geometry than I am, identified a couple. So here's one along Montreal Road for those of you who know Ottawa well. I think it's got all the colors on here, so just look at, so it's fairly high, and you can click on any of these particular images and find what the value was, so of all the variables. So this was a 32 out of that 100. So it looks pretty high. It's not the highest, but there's as the old adage goes, the picture's worth 1,000 words, or 1,000,000 numbers in this case. But it's a nice way to actually look at the final results of what that whole exercise is about. So we finished this work up in last summer, and as most of you probably know, OC Transpo is pretty focused on rearranging their network and getting ready for the new LRT line that's going in relatively soon. So the intent was for these files and these maps to be, we have given them to OC Transpo. They want to do some analysis on their own. This is kind of a first level cut at identifying, using a data-driven approach to identify where transit priority measures might be most helpful. Obviously, the next steps are to identify, use these maps to identify where they are, and then to look at them on a one-by-one basis to see if it's even possible and what type of measures might most make sense. So maybe I'll leave it there. I think Brendon's going to come on next with his presentation, and then I think there'll be time for questions if any of you have any. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Bill. That's it's quite the manipulation of data, and as Bill mentioned, we'll hold questions until the end. Bill, I think, can you pass me control, or let me see, I can do it myself, I think.
I just
yeah, okay, there we go.
Yeah.
So going to change gears a little bit. Bill gave an excellent example of the kinds of sophisticated manipulation one can do by doing data fusion and processing various data for specific perspectives. I'm going to take a sort of higher level discussion presentation of uses of data, a sort of history, uses of data, and challenges to put things a bit in perspective. Just as background, I know many of you on the call, on the webinar, but if you don't know me, I worked 15 years at CUDA, the Canadian Urban Transit Association, was the main technical person there, and ran a research program of which one of the projects was on the use of data, and that dates back to early 90s. For the last 19 years, I've been an independent consultant, but I'm sort of unusual because I work with the industry on many projects, but also have very close ties with academia and have been very involved in Transportation Research Board, TRB, where I was chair of the Transit Planning Committee for many years and a emeritus member of that. And so I try to bridge the gap between research and practice in my whole career. So this is one of those very special areas where there should be better ties between research and practice, but for reasons I'll show, it's been a challenging effort. So I'll try to go fairly quickly through this, a fair amount of information, and I'll show a discussion paper I presented that summarizes some of the things I'm talking about, and you're welcome to contact me to get a copy of it afterwards. But I want to just sort of take a little bit of a historical perspective on this, then dive into the types of applications one can see with using ITS data for transit planning and management, some of the many challenges why this data is not used as much as it should be by the industry, and some suggestions and new developments which are holding some promise. So in terms of evolution, for those of you that may not have as long a background as Bill and I in this field, AVL systems date back to the 1980s, first in Europe and then in Canada. But the focus of most of the systems put in place, and remains until today, the focus is primarily on security, incident management, and service restoration to some extent. And the industry relies primarily on standard operating procedures. However, the whole use of data appeared fairly early. I organized a conference back in 1988 where we already had a session on using AVL data. And following that, I managed to report on the use of AVL APC data where some leaders knew what could be done, even without the sophisticated visualization tools, how you could use it for very basic analyses that one should be doing. There are a couple TCRP. TCRP is a special program of the Transportation Research Board, Transit Cooperative Research Program, that specifically look at ITS data. 113, I was a sub-team member on that project. Specifically looks at AVL and APC data, and then TCRP 126 looks at it for market research. sort of in mid-2008, and so from then on, some of the suppliers started providing analytic modules, canned reports that you can get as when you acquire new ITS systems, AVL, APC systems. But then things started really changing. I've been following this for a long time, and dashboards started appearing, discussion of big data. TRB created a subcommittee on TransitData. And as I go to conferences, I see that many transit systems find the technology is growingly mature, but they actually start thinking about the use of the data. But at the same time, I'm noticing a growing gap between the leaders who are really into very sophisticated analysis using data and the majority of industry, which is still struggling with cleaning up the data and getting sort of basic analyses of on-time performance and on-off counts and so forth into their mode of operation. But as I'll finish up, there's some new promising developments. But one of the things that I've been involved in, why I wanted to give this presentation, is I've been part of a small group of international academics who have been organizing workshops on the use. First, they started with using smart card data. These are academics that actually are interested in doing applied research. This is rather rare in the academic world, but this is one area where it lends itself very well to do so. And as data became more readily accessible and more open and more available, growing number of academics sort of around the world, small to start off with, but a growing number, have been starting to think about this. And I was invited to be one of the, I guess, token non-academics involved in the steering committee for these workshops. And so there have been 4 workshops to date. The first one was in Japan, and it focused specifically on the use of smart card data, and one of the key concerns is how you develop inference engines so that you can develop origin destination matrices from the smart card data. So that was followed by one with Boston, where it was sort of opened up into looking at incorporating and doing data fusion with AVL and APC data. APCs, automatic passenger encounters, AVLs, automatic vehicle locations, as Bill mentioned. That was followed by a workshop in Santiago de Chile, which are also very much involved. People there in both universities are very much involved in this sort of field. And that started opening up discussions about operations-based applications using real-time data and on bus transit systems. And last year, there was one in Brisbane in conjunction with a ongoing conference series called CAS-PT, which focuses on scheduling and optimization. And one of the interesting things that came out of there was increased focus on use of passive data. So I'm going to give a little sort of a high-level overview of the types of applications. So these first 3 slides are actually from the 1991 report that I supervised, and that was collated examples of kinds of reports that people way back then were already doing using AVL and APC data. And graphics were not fancy, it was very tabular, but as you look at the level, these are examples of data used for service planning. And you can sort of see the kinds of things that I think most transit agencies are very concerned about. Then there were the ones related to operational control, line management. It has to do with reports on mechanical failures and pass-ups and broken buses and so forth, and trip cancellations. And then executive information, that's a very high level, the kinds of things that policy boards and general management and policy boards would be interested in. So some transit systems knew what kinds of data would be valuable to use, I mean, for some time. But this has created a bit of a gap that's been a long time, and the industry as a whole is just starting to get to the point where all of this, one sees these kinds of reports and the use of these reports more widely spread. So I developed from this and from the workshops that I mentioned, sort of a typology of how the data could be driven, and I'll spend just a few minutes on this. Systematic monitoring. This is using the data for dashboards, the kinds that are posted for public consumption, and executive management with high-level key performance indicators, KPIs, alarms of, to indicate major problems occurring. Service and operations planning, of course, are interested in things like monitoring on an ongoing basis, on-time performance, scheduled adherence, running time analyses, operator performance. The data can also be used is used as a major input to strategic analyses, major campaigns and redesigns of whole networks or major corridors. And then tactical analyses, focusing in on something very specific, delays by intersection, locations for priority treatment, as Bill was just showing one very detailed analysis that the data can be used for, excessive stop dwell time, stop consolidation campaigns, things of that sort. And then I've seen also more sophisticated places that use the data combined with other data for exploratory data mining, safety analyses. Portland, for example, used some data after a tragic collision of a pedestrian to figure out if there was patterns that were appearing where the accidents occurred, but also accessibility and equity. And I recently, although it's taken a long time for it to occur, I see decision support for real-time operational control, analyses of gaps and bunching as they occur. I'm going to run through fairly quickly some of the themes that have emerged from these workshops over the last couple of years, these 4 or 5 workshops. A lot of academics, of course, are very interested in methodological issues. That's a major concern, especially starting off with origin destination inference. How do you take tap on only data and develop both trips inbound and outbound, and making all assumptions of patterns of behavior. But there's all sorts of other ones, as you can sort of see. Methodological analyses are very important for academics. In terms of analyses, some of the themes that I notice: travel behavior, given where people live, when do they choose to go to one stop versus another? How far are they willing to walk? Route choice. What happens in cases of disruptions, especially in heavy-duty rail systems like Transport for London or MTR in Hong Kong? Sources of delay, focus for priority, on-time performance, service planning, transfers, where do they occur, and optimization of networks when feasible. Other themes. These are sort of new horizons that appeared in the last workshop last year. Growing interest in using passive data from smartphones, cell phones, also social media sort of data. Behavior and disruptions. How do people behave? What happens when there's disruptions in rail service, subway service, crowding, passenger movements? What kinds of information can you use? How can you use that data to give better advice to passengers? The growing number of studies about fare evasion patterns. This is a particular concern in places like Santiago of Chile. Predictive analytics, passenger loads. How do you predict over time, sort of not only historical patterns, but when there are disruptions, when distortions may occur in those passenger loads. And as I mentioned, real-time operational control dashboards, very interesting work I've seen in New York City with real-time gaps and bunching dashboards given to dispatchers of the subway system. And also, there's a few systems that are starting to open up data under the whole pressure of open data. So not only providing real-time passenger information data, but actually providing more detailed AVL, APC type data and making it available. Not very many places are doing that, but it is a trend that's starting to appear. Challenges. Well, first, I would say to start off with, there is an increasing focus on data. Transit ITS data is a valuable resource. It has the potential to create valuable information to enhance effectiveness and efficiency. And there's a lot of discussion, a lot of words thrown around: business intelligence, data analytics, decision support systems, open data, big data, smart cities. I think there's growing interest that's illustrated by that. But the challenges are significant. By and large, I perceive that personal perspective that the transit industry is not using the data it collects and is poorly positioned to expand its use in the future, where we're going to talk about massive big data in smart cities and data coming from various sources outside of transit, transportation, health, security, electric grids, and so forth and so on. Some of the things that, some of these challenges relate back to the essential nature of transit, where it's really an operations-based, risk-averse environment. And senior management policy boards, by and large, have a lack of interest or lack of knowledge about technology and data, and that's not how they're judged in terms of their performance. Innovation is not, and optimization is not how they're judged. It's keeping the system running as smoothly as possible and getting, when things mess up, to get back to where they were before as fast as possible. That's a pretty important thing, because it sort of dictates the fact that there's not the kinds of resources and staff that are often needed to carry out sophisticated analyses like the ones that Bill was pointing to. But there's also the fact that a lot of the technology was designed for purposes of operations, in the case of CAD AVL systems, or for finance, in the case of smart cards. And in many cases, the use of the data was very much an afterthought. It's changing slowly, which is great, but that's a big concern. And other things that sort of are challenges: confusion over benefits and strategy, lack of resources, technical expertise and tools, data management challenges. It's a lot of data, and it's challenging to actually use it. Very big concerns about, cleaning up the data, quality assurance, and external pressures about accountability and open data. At the same time, sort of contradictory privacy protection and also performance-based management. To summarize some of these, I worked for several years for supporting U.S. Department of Transportation on transit ITS activities, and developed a discussion paper. It's about 20 pages and summarized in more detail some of the things that I just mentioned. And if anybody's interested in this, just drop me a line. My email's at the end, and I'd be glad to send it to you. And there are broader challenges. As I mentioned, transit's primarily operations-driven, risk-averse. And so one does not see, it's not until recently that one is really starting to see some interest in data and the use of data. And vendors and consultants naturally respond to the kinds of requests for proposals for services that the industry puts out. And if they're not asking for specialists in data, or asking for data analyses, or for tools that allow for better data analysis, it's unlikely that vendors and consultants will provide those. Academics work in silos and have little interaction with the real world. It's the nature of the academic system. There's some very big barriers for them. Their whole benefit system is based on publishing papers in very high-end academic journals that nobody in the industry has access to and could actually understand if they get them. So even those interested in applied research have trouble interacting. Now, some of these academic institutions and university professors that I've been working with and have been involved in these workshops are sort of the exception in this area. And then there are proprietary systems and lack of standards that really prevents the sharing of data and applications. So in general, research, technology, innovation, use of data are really hard sells in the transit environment. But not to leave on a note of doom and gloom, I think there are some things that might be thought about to propel increased use of data. So making the case for data analytics to policymakers through use cases, trying to calculate return on investment, and especially more focus on visualization. Those tools have powerful impact on policy, general management, and policymakers. And I think just generally facilitating technology transfer through data specifications and APIs, collaboration with vendors, collaboration with academics. None of this is easy, but I think these are directions that we should be pursuing more. And there's some promising new developments. I think there's a convergence, finally, that I see the convergence between those transit systems with people who have been pursuing data and its use over the years, with the general industry that is coming to terms with more accessible data and better tools. So their CAD-AVL systems provide easier access to the data, and academics who are doing applications that are of more relevance to the industry. And so here are a couple examples of these, and then new developments and standards. So here's a couple examples that I just want to finish up on with. So as I mentioned, growing interest in data analytics and transit systems. I see that more and more. I see also growing academic focus on data analytics that are more applied. And I know we have folks from both University of Toronto and Polytechnique who both have been part of the transit data workshops that are on the webinar, have been leaders in the world on the use of data. There's a workshop this year's workshop will be in Paris. Its focus will be on visualization primarily of transit data. There's been since 2014 a joint subcommittee at TRB on transformative trends in transit data, which now receives, along with one other committee, the second highest number of papers in the public transportation group at TRB. And then there's three efforts I'll finish up with on data standards that are worth keeping an eye on. One is a TCRP study on demand responsive transit data standards that should be published this year. It's been in the works for a couple of years. Now, this presentation is primarily on fixed route standard regular transit, but that should enable better use of applications and sophisticated tools by having better standards for defining data. There is a new project, a TCRP project starting off that is actually looking specifically at transit ITS data in the sort of the fixed route regular environment. And that's related, for those who may have heard of, the TIDES project that was pioneered by John Levin to develop sets of APIs that allow for better sharing of data and applications. And I just heard recently, I've been in communications with academics at University of Toronto, Megan Katsumi and Mark Fox, who have been developing, now it's not transit ITS specific, but it's still along the lines of data standardization and ontology for transportation planning. And as you can see there, the project will define a standard for representing and publishing the semantics of data used by cities to drive their transportation planning activities. That's transportation, all transportation, urban transportation planning activities. These definitions will be published in a machine-readable form. This will enable development of software tools that can consume, verify, and make inferences about transportation data. So all these developments are very promising, and I think there's there's going to be increasing interest in this. And with this in mind, I volunteered with my colleague Amr Shalabi at the University of Toronto, Faculty of Applied Science and Engineering, to sponsor next year's Transit Data Workshop, which will take place in the summer of 2020 in Toronto. And we will keep you informed. We haven't chosen the dates yet, but my objective in that is to really bring more industry participation into the workshop so that there's a better exchange of information, that help academics become more realistic about what is needed by the industry, and have industry representatives understand and see the kinds of very interesting applications being developed by academics. So that was a very quick discussion, but I wanted to make sure there was some time for questions. If anybody wants to get a copy of that short discussion paper on uses and challenges related to transit ITS data, feel free to do so. So with that, I'd like to open it up to questions. And there is if you've noticed, a question box. And I'm having a little trouble opening it up to a point that I can actually see the questions. Oops, oh, looks like there's a couple there. Sorry. Okay. Are you able to touch? So yes, please put questions in for either Bill or Marcel. Okay, how do we create a culture where transit agency staff start believing in the information which data provides and are confident of taking decisions based on this data. I think it has to, and this is from Rajiv, thanks Rajiv. It's not easy. Because given the culture is really, this is not an industry that has ever really been based in using data. And the same sort of applies generally to the use of technology. I think it's back to my suggestions of trying to find ways of prove and to convince the senior management and policy board members that there are specific benefits in investing in data. I'm sure everyone has some cases or some situations where they were able to provide analysis that did the trick. I've heard of stories of using visualization tools, which, as Bill mentioned, visualization often really helps to convince people and make things more apparent, relationships that are complex. I've mentioned to vendors, and I see it more and more, but until recently, vendors, I'd go to conferences and they would just do sales pitches. And I said, well, that's not what you really need to do. What you need to do is say, who are your power users? Get them up to say, how did they use their tools, your CAD AVL systems to improve service planning or real-time operations or service restoration, and sort of use cases in that respect. But it's going to be a challenging road. I think there are an increasing number of general managers and policy board members who are starting to who understand technology, but it's going to be a long haul. Let me see. Let's see if I can try to figure out a way to maybe. Yannicka, can you read? I'm having a little trouble opening it up to a point I can read the questions. Are there any other questions?
It's Yannicka here. I think if you double click on the actual question box, it'll open a little screen underneath.
Okay, yeah. Yes, thank you. I got it now. Okay. Okay, we have that one. Is there any? Here we go. Are you looking into extracting transit travel demand data from cell phones and GPS-enabled cars? I'm personally not doing that, but there were several efforts and research projects that are working on that sort of approach, both for transit specific, but more generally for transportation in general. And there are different technologies available, but I saw recently a presentation where trying to combine using cell phone signals that's being made available by cell phone companies to actually provide origin destination type patterns, and then combining that with smart card data to get more detailed breakdown of the transit portion of those patterns. So yes, this is clearly an area that's growing in use.
It's Bill here. We've worked with cell phone data on a couple projects. We actually source the data from another company that has actually done all the hard work of assembling it and processing it, and you get access to it in a very visual form. You can actually designate the zones, basically create an OD, origin destination data. You pick the zone, you can define your own zones, and then it'll assemble the information into the zoning system you want to use. What we've seen so far is that you don't get absolute numbers on the number of people traveling between a pair of zones, for example, or where does people come to, travel to in a specific zone or from a specific zone. But you get indices saying how important that travel pattern is. We did a project with Windsor, Transit Windsor, it's still ongoing actually, but we've used that type of data to try and identify what the major travel OD patterns that the transit system there does not serve very well, and trying to make an estimate of whether it'd be worth serving it, what level of service would be required. So, that's something that's relatively available and not that expensive to use as well. And, as a potential, I'm not so sure it's a replacement to traditional OD surveys, but it's certainly a supplement to OD data that may be available either through surveys or from onboard fare collection data.
Bill, I've got a question for you. You one of the aspects of your analysis there was that you added in the APC data, the passenger counts, as part of your analysis of priority. That sort of goes beyond what normally is done with just analyzing intersection delays and dwell times at stops and things like that, which has just come straight from the AVL data. Did you feel that really added something, a dimension that was worth the extra effort?
Yeah, I think so. Most of the effort actually was on wrangling with the AVL data because it's very diverse and unstructured. Dealing with the APC data was not that it's simple, but it's a little bit easier. And I think for the particular issue that Ottawa had identified, if you're going to implement transit priority measures, you want to put them where they'll do the most good. And the level of service operating over particular lengths on the segment is important, but it's also important to hit the ones that are used a lot by people in terms of your ridership. So I think it's quite an important element to include in the analysis.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. Yannicka, do you see any other questions? I don't see any per se. I guess another question for you, Bill. The big drop in your data from 900,000 to 500,000 had to do with the stop summaries. I'm not sure I totally understood why there was such a huge drop there.
Well, it wasn't necessarily a drop. We were kind of transitioning raw AVL records into something that actually had some meaning. So, okay. You might have, in a particular example, you might have 3 records in AVL that actually refer to the same stop. And so what you're really trying to do is say, okay, what's really happening at that particular stop, and trying to collapse that information into a single record. So it's not like you went from 900,000 AVL records to 500,000 AVL records. You went from 900,000 AVL records into, in the end, it turned out to be about 70,000, I think, place link records that were actually meaningful for the analysis at hand. So it's, but generally speaking, it's the first time I've worked extensively with AVL data, and kudos to the folks at OC Transpo. They have well-organized data, and I was pleasantly surprised about how much of it we were actually able to use. I thought we'd have to throw away a lot more than we did. So, so that was actually good news in that particular study.
Yes, no, well, that raises the whole issue about cleaning up data and quality assurance. Many systems struggled for years, and many still do, trying to get the data into a place that's usable. Often it's not easy to assign it even to a stop, and some systems just provide timestamp related data as opposed to really matching it to stops. I know you had a lot of experience with that in Winnipeg. Do you want to maybe just touch on that?
Yeah, that's a really important point. I think what can happen unintentionally is that as new ITS systems are implemented in a transit system, they can be done in kind of silos, so that the primary purpose of each of these systems is somewhat distinct from what the type of thing I was doing for Ottawa there. So that there's not necessarily an incentive unless it's recognized up front that when speccing these systems, that you pay attention to how the data is organized and what key fields need to be common in the various systems so that you can link data afterwards. So it requires a lot of thought to that when you're speccing these systems. And typically what happens is that these systems aren't all implemented at once. Typically one's done first, and then as money becomes available and other systems installed, and it might be many years before they're all done. But at the beginning, it's important to have an overall plan about how you want to go forward, how you want the data to be set up, because the scheduling system data that gives the network, the geometry of the network, and the schedule information, that's going to feed a lot of these other systems, and it's important that be thought through so that when everything is implemented and you want to drag data out of each of them, that you can start to put them together to create more intelligence. In some case, I know in several instances that it's hard for systems to do that, but it's important to take that kind of comprehensive look and maybe a long-term look in planning how ITS is actually installed and implemented over a number of years.
Yeah, that's a challenge because, as I mentioned, a lot of these systems were primarily aimed at operations purposes and security, incident management, and so forth. And a lot of transit systems just rely on, the requirements for the data logging and analysis part doesn't receive as much attention, and things like that are not really often taken into consideration, which makes it difficult. I think that's what we have in terms of questions. Yannicka, do you see any others?
No.
No. Okay. Well, hopefully everyone got some useful information out of this. Welcome to contact us, and if you have any questions about follow-up questions, and please get in touch if you're interested in being involved in the APTS committee on sort of on an ongoing basis. And I'd like to thank Bill for making his presentation, and Yannicka for helping set this all up, and we'll let it go with that, and hope you have a good evening. Thank you very much.
Brendon?
Yes?
Before everybody goes, would I be able to say a few words of thanks as well?
Sure, go ahead, Yannicka.
So on behalf of the ITS Canada Secretariat and Board of Directors, thank you, Brendon, for organizing. Thank you both, Brendon and Bill, for presenting today. And thank you to the audience members for having attended today's webinar. I want to take this opportunity to share with you a few important current and upcoming ITS Canada events. As all of you know, 6 of ITS Canada's current board of directors are up for election in 2019. The 29th slate for the ITS Canada Board of Directors is now available on the ITS Canada website. ITS Canada and the Ontario Traffic Council are co-organizing a workshop entitled ITS Today, Technologies Across Ontario on June 19th, which is being hosted by Wattcar. You can register online for this event on the ITS Canada website. Registration will open next week for the 2019 ITS Canada TAC Joint Conference, which takes place in Halifax, September 22nd to September 25. And like Brendon mentioned, I encourage today audience members to become engaged in the various ITS Canada technical committees. If you are interested, you can send me an email. And that was it. Thank you, Brendon, for allowing me the opportunity to say a few words of thanks.
Oh, absolutely. Okay, well, thank you all, and we'll hopefully you'll join us for another event in the future. Thank you very much.